السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of God, who is gracious, most merciful, may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As it was now mentioned, we are in the attributes of God. Maybe we can do a 1 minute, 2 minute recap quickly. We are now, for those following in the book, at lesson 9. Today is lesson 9. So last lesson was just a recap and Q's and A's. So a few lessons ago, we started with the proofs for the existence of God, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we presented two big proofs. We said the first one is what the author considers to be what he called the simple proof for the existence of God. And in philosophy, it's usually referred to as the teleological argument, or the argument by design. So we look at the world and we see that it has design and order. So we ask, where does that order come from? And the strength of that proof for the existence of God is that it not only gives us the existence of God, but also a number of His attributes at the same time. And then the second proof for the existence of God that we presented was the one that is usually referred to as the proof of the necessary being. And we said the world, when we look at everything that exists in it, can be made up of two things. Things that are contingent, and things that are necessary. Everything is contingent because it does not necessarily need to exist. But if everything is contingent, then nothing ever ends up existing. So at some point, to avoid infinite regress, we have to find some entity that lies outside of this chain and causes the entire chain to exist. And we said that is the necessary being. Following on that, we said that the weakness of that argument, that proof for the existence of God, is that while it does prove the existence of a necessary being, it does prove the existence of God, it does not prove any of the attributes of God. So for the attributes of God, if we want to rely on the proof of the necessary being, we're going to need proofs from elsewhere. We're going to need arguments to prove the attributes one by one, outside of that argument itself. So we said before actually going into the actual attributes, the proofs for the attributes, there are a couple of, let's call them descriptors, describers, that we can still extract from the necessary being argument. And those are basically that the necessary being, first of all, has to be absolutely autonomous, has to have absolute autonomy. That's one. And two, the necessary being must be the source of all existence. Not only the existence of the entities, but the existence of the qualities, or in philosophy they refer to them as the perfections of those entities. This is what opened the door to a discussion, a short discussion about the notion of causality. So we said something, when it is said to be a cause of something else, a cause for something else, that causality can be understood in different ways. So in philosophy we have a number of different types of causes. One of them is the one that we're using to understand the causality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which we said does not fit any of the other types of causes because they're always partial, the other types of causes. And so we refer to the Aristotelian causes. There's 4 causes. Islamic philosophy came and added more nuance and more detail to the causes of Aristotle. But at the end of the day, all those causes are always partial. They do not go as far as to explain the existence of every being as well as every quality that it contains. And this is the difference between the causality of the necessary being, which not only explains the existence but also the qualities, and it's the perpetuity of the existence of everything that depends on it. And we gave a number of examples. We said, for instance, the watchmaker can make a watch and leave the watch, and the watchmaker can go die and the watch will still work on its own. This is one type of causality that is different, let's say, from the light that we see in a room that relies on a bulb or a candle. The moment that flame goes down or that light bulb is turned off, there's no more light. The light requires the bulb to be on every instant. The same thing for the shape of water in a receptacle, in a container. That shape of water is maintained by that container every instant. The moment it changes, so the causality there is not the type that you trigger something and you let it be and it stays in that state. It must be maintained every instant. So these are examples just to bring the image or the concept a little bit closer to our minds. So this is kind of a quick recap of what we've covered so far. So now we want to continue where we left off, and we want to get a little bit deeper into the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the first lesson about the attributes had to do with what we could take away, extract from what we've said until now, without adding anything new. So we said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala must be absolutely simple, and that was derived from our understanding of absolute autonomy. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not only not rely on anything outside of Him, but He cannot either rely on any of His own parts. He cannot have parts. If He had parts, if He was made up of parts, then He would be relying on something. Those parts must be there for Him to exist in the manner in which He exists. So, and that's the example that we gave. You could potentially take a line and split it mentally, but if you did that, if you were able to do that with the necessary being, it's not really a necessary being anymore. So that's one thing, and then if we take that to its logical conclusion, it means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot have any of the attributes that we know of anything, including specifically for us, matter, or anything that is contained in space and time. And then we also emphasized a little bit more on this notion of causality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what we extracted from everything we've said so far. Now we want to go a little bit more classic. So this was a little bit more philosophical, and what we could take out from specifically the necessary being argument. Now we're going to go back a little bit more classic kalam to the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the outline of the lesson, very simple. Introduction, a distinction made between the attributes of essence and attributes of action. The proof for the attributes of essence. So we get a very general proof, and then we get one specific proof that is usually the general proof applied to these three specific attributes, which are the most important ones, and the attributes of essence, life, power, and knowledge. So, introduction. We're not going to repeat everything we've said so far. The conclusion from all of this is that the causality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one we described or we referred to as Allah being a creative cause or an existential cause. Sometimes it's also translated or referred to as a primal cause, to distinguish from every other type of causality. And we said one of the distinctive features of this type of causality is that it doesn't only cause the existence of the entity which relies on it, but also all of its qualities. In Islamic philosophy, the qualities of something, the descriptors, the attributes of something are usually referred to as its perfections. So if you see this insistence on the word perfection in Islamic philosophy specifically, it's because if something exists, it has a level of perfection, as opposed to if it does not exist. To exist means you have a level of perfection. But that perfection is always imperfect, so to speak. It's deficient, it's limited, it has gaps, it has lacks. So the more perfection becomes a gradation. It's not an absolute. And this is an important notion to understand in Islamic philosophy. It's not you're perfect or you're not. The moment something exists, it is in the realm of the perfect. But the realm of the perfect is infinite. So there's a gradation. The more perfection you have means the more existence you have, the more power you have, the higher on the scale of existence you are, and so on and so forth, depending on which school of philosophy you follow. But the bottom line is, when Islamic philosophy talks about perfection, it's really talking about either existence itself or some of the qualities of existence. Okay? So, when we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the cause of the being of something and the cause of its perfections, we're saying it's the cause of its qualities, of its attributes, of its descriptions. So the author gives us two examples. He says, first of all, what we mean by this, if we find that there are things in the world, they must have come from somewhere, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And those are the perfections, and the necessary being must have them, otherwise we would not find them in the world. So he gives the example of the teacher teaching, basically bestowing knowledge on students. When the teacher teaches and the student learns from that knowledge, they gain that knowledge. Has the teacher lost anything? Has the teacher lost any amount of knowledge? Has that knowledge been passed on to, in the sense that the teacher no longer possesses it, like money or like something material? No. The teacher keeps that knowledge and the student is still able to acquire it. So he says, maybe this starts to help us understand when we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala must possess everything that He gives, but He does not lose anything by giving it. It does not require any effort on His part. It does not take away anything from Him to give. Then he says, perhaps the example is not too good, because this is a very limiting example and so on and so forth. So he says, let's use a much better example, the one that is used in the Holy Quran. So he refers to the verse of light, Ayat al-Nur. Allahu nuru samawati wal-ard. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. So he does not explain at all what he means by that. So we take maybe 2 minutes just to explain most likely what he means by his reference to that. If we go to the books of Quranic interpretation and commentaries, there's a lot that has been written about this verse specifically, the verse of the light. And without going into all the nuances and the explanations, the bottom line that we want to take out that is relevant to us here is the definition that is given for light. So what is light? In what sense is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the light of the heavens and the earth? What does that mean? If we want to condense it into a minute. Basically, they say if we look at all the lights in the world and we forget about their specificity. I want to look at light as light, not as this light or that light, this type of light, this kind of light or that kind of light. There's all sorts of different kinds of light. So let's put the distinctions of those lights aside and keep only the notion of light. What is light at the end? How best do we define it? So the best definition that they came up with is light has two qualities. Light is that which is self-evident and which makes other things evident. So that becomes your philosophical understanding of light, abstracted from every type, every distinction, every kind of light. If we want to take it light as light, what is light as light? Light as light is that which is manifest by itself and that which makes other things manifest. So that's the best they came up with as a definition. And so they come back to the verse of light. So in what sense is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the light of the heavens and the earth? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that which is most manifest by itself. And we're not going to talk about this proof in this course, but there's a whole proof in philosophy called Burhan al-Siddiqeen, the proof of the Siddiqeen or the virtuous, for instance, which is entirely based on the idea that you cannot use anything to prove the existence of God, because if you do that, you're basically saying that that thing has more evidence in its existence than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then when you go to the riwayat and when you go to the Quran, you see that the insistence of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, for instance, they say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that which is the most evident. And everything else requires His existence in order to become evident. So for people like me, I may understand it as a notion, but I don't see it. And that's why the Quran for people like me gives me the simple proof that look at the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and use the signs to point to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whereas Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam in Dua Arafah, he says, may the eye that does not see you become blind. عميت عين لا تراك عليها رقيبا. Right? Like, or in Dua al-Sabah, Imam Ali alayhi salam, he says, يا من دل على ذاته بذاته. O you who has signaled or pointed to his own existence by his own existence. There's nothing outside of it. It's only the weak and the blind, if you want to use the other expression of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, who cannot see that. So this is a completely different way of understanding the existence of God. So putting all of that aside, okay, that requires a lecture on its own, or many lectures on its own. The idea is that in the light of the verse of the light, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that which is self-evident, and that which makes everything else evident. So he's saying that everything, including the existence of the heavens and the earth, including the qualities of the heavens and the earth, require Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order to be what they are. So he's saying it's a lot more than the teacher bestowing his knowledge to the student without losing anything. It's like the light that is shined on something which is self-evident by itself, and that which makes everything else that is it's shined upon evident as well. Anyways, keeping that in mind, as I said, the author does not go into any detail. He just says the verse, the example of light to understand the causality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a lot more appropriate, and he refers to the verse without any explanation. So that's a little bit of explanation around this. Now, attributing perfections to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the author says, basically, based on everything we've said until now, when we look at the world and we see that everything has qualities, descriptions, attributes, we must ask ourselves, where do they come from? The same argumentation, the same proof, the same rationale that we used to prove the existence of Allah is now going to be used to explain the qualities. So not only is the existence of the thing requiring a necessary being, but the qualities of that thing also require a necessary being. The same exact argumentation. It's not only why does it exist, it's why does it exist in this manner? Where does this come from? So the same, to avoid falling into the same trap of the infinite regress for the being of everything, the qualities, the descriptions, the attributes of those things require the same type of argumentation. So can we attribute every perfection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Yes, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail in that. So everything we see in the world becomes something that must have come from the necessary being, with the condition that what we see in the world is limited, is imperfect, has constraints, limitations that we talked about in the previous lecture, 2 previous lectures, when we talked about anything being defined by time, by space, by parts, and so on and so forth. So yes, we notice the qualities, we notice the attributes. Are they an indication of a necessary being that has them? Yes, but not in the exact same way, because they are limited, constrained, with gaps, with deficiencies when we see them in this world, the way they're manifested in this world. Now, here's where he says, and we talked a little bit about this already, when we go to the books of philosophy and theology, they take the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and they split them into 2 big parts. The attributes of essence, the attributes of action. So what are the attributes of essence and what are the attributes of action? When you look at something, you can look at that thing in itself, by itself, without looking at anything else. Or you look at it as having a relationship with something else. I can look at each and every one of you and I say, you are Abdullah, and Abdullah has these specific qualities and distinctions. I'm looking at you as you. Human being, male, of this height, of this weight, of whatever makes you, you. I could also look at you as having a relationship with your father, and so you are a son, or you may be a father because you have a relationship with a child, or you may be a student because you have a relationship with an educational institution. Now we're looking at you from a relationship point of view. So what is your relationship with other entities? So I'm not looking at you only as you, I'm looking at you as having relationships and looking at it only from that angle. To understand what we mean by attributes of essence and attributes of action, that's what we have to keep in mind. So if we want to look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as Him, only Him, without thinking about anything else that exists, then we're talking about attributes of essence. When we talk about attributes of action, we're basically talking about the relationship between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and other beings, which, for instance, we can say they are His creatures. Okay, so that's a relationship. There's a relationship of creation between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and those creatures, those beings. I can look at it from another angle. I can look at a human being and say, yeah, on one angle, he is the creature of Allah, the creation of Allah. So that's one attribute, that's one relationship. Or I can say, he needs sustenance or provision from Allah. He needs rizq from Allah. Okay, that's another attribute. Right? He needs rahmah from Allah. That's another attribute. That's another relationship. Each one of these relationships gives you one of the attributes that we call the attributes of action. So if we're looking at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by Himself without looking at any other entity around Him, no other relationships, only the notion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we're talking about attributes of essence. If we're looking at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as having relationships with other creatures, other beings, then we're talking about attributes of action. Simple enough? Yes.
So I said what?
Pardon me?
Actually, is the attributes of actually the relationship between the Allah, the subject, the creator of the action, and the essence is what?
Essence?
Sorry,
the essence is only Allah, without relationships, without looking at anything except Allah. You only look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Is it an attribute we would understand?
Yeah, we can understand.
We can understand it?
Yes.
Okay.
We can understand the attributes. That's positive and negative. We talked a little bit about that. We'll talk a little bit more about it. So we can understand that even without the relationship, but it's a mental exercise of abstraction. You eliminate things mentally until you only have one thing left, and that's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what you're doing. So here's examples. So for instance, when we look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and we say we're going to talk about power, so I don't want to use that as too much of an example, but let's say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has power. So power being the ability to do something. I don't need to say there's anything else happening. It's an intrinsic, it's an essential ability. It's already in Him. Even if there is nothing else going on, even if He does not use it, it's there. So it becomes an attribute of essence. But if I say Allah creates, and we're going to add a nuance. I remember a question we got a few weeks ago, so we're going to go back to it. It was a good question. Let's say creation. If I say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has creatorship, it implies that there's another aspect, another side to that relationship, which is receiving that creation. Right?
Yeah.
Make sense? Simple?
The thing that's created.
The thing that is created, the creature, there's a relationship between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the creature. For the power, so long as Allah has not used the power is contained in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but He has not used it. So I'm only looking at Allah and I say, Allah must have power. If He uses it, it becomes an attribute of action.
Then you can call Him creator.
For instance, so He uses the power to create, so He becomes a creator. Same thing with knowledge. I'm going to add the nuance in a second.
Earlier that applied, the essence becomes the action.
It's derived out of it.
The power itself stays of essence, right?
This is why we have that example at the end. So I need that point to be understood so that we go to the next one. So we add the nuance. So the distinction between essence and action needs to be clear. So is that part clear? We're looking at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only as Him, as the attributes that He has. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has life. We'll explain what life is. Allah has knowledge. Allah has power. These are the three main ones, as we said of this. And there are some that derive out of those. And that's why those are the three main ones. Because all the other attributes can be derived out of them. Okay? And then there's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as having a relationship with other beings, which are His creatures. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala having a relationship. The moment there's a relationship, we're in the attributes of action. That part so far is good? Okay, now we're going to add one more layer. Some of the attributes, depending on how we want to look at it, can fall into one or the other. So if I want to look at Allah's knowledge, yeah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has knowledge. Whether there is something or not, Allah alim. The nature of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all-knowing. Whether there is something to know or there isn't something to know, Allah is all-knowing. If Allah applies that knowledge to something that now exists, this has become a ilm fi'li. It becomes an action or an agent knowledge, an active knowledge. So it becomes an attribute of action. Same thing with power. If the power is not being used, the power is there. So it's an attribute of essence. If it's directed towards something, now there's a relationship with a something, it became an attribute of action. And usually when you reach that, we have other words for those attributes too. Okay? So life, omnipotence, and omniscience. As-sami' al-basir, all hearing, all seeing. Obviously, they can be derived from knowledge. And that's why those become the three top ones. Life, knowledge, and power. Qudra, ilm, hayat. Because every other attribute, whether action or essence, you should be able to derive it from those three.
So these three are essence?
These three are essence.
Okay.
The attributes of action, we're going to see them next lesson, not even this lesson. Okay, we're not going to give examples. I'm only giving examples of attributes of action that can be looked at, depending on how you look at them. They can be seen, depending on whether Allah applied it to a thing or not, can be seen as of essence or of action. But today we're only talking about attributes of essence, so that we don't confuse them. Yes?
Some argue that there's more than three. There's four.
It's 7. So the classic textbooks can mention 7. There's issues with the 7, and I don't want to get into it today.
Okay.
But basically they add as-sami' al-basir and 2 others. Okay, and there are other, of course, like you could say Allah Hakim, for instance. No problem. That is an attribute of essence. But you could bring it back to ilm and qudra. So it depends on how you're going to define these.
So in this book, he goes with 3.
He says the main are 3. And in fact, now I'm going to add one more question for you guys. I'm not going to answer it, just to keep it in mind, because there is a disagreement about this. And when we're going to go into a little bit more detail about each one of them, you're going to see it right away where the issue is. So give me 1 second. The example here, so for instance, ilm, do we say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ilm is an attribute of essence or action? So the point here, that's last line, was to make that point. If you're talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala having knowledge just by himself, then this is an attribute of essence. Allah alim. Allah is all-knowing. But if that knowledge is applied, and this becomes very useful, especially when you read the Quran very meticulously. There are times when the Quran, for instance, says, لِيَعْلَمَ اللَّهُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we want you to do something, or we want to test you so that we know, or so that Allah knows. Allah doesn't know. Of course Allah knows. Allah knows by essence. This is by action. This is the knowledge that comes as a result of you having acted the act. Allah knows how you're going to do it. Of course He knows pre-eternally. This is another level, in math they'd say another order. Okay, this is at the action level. So this is, the first one was al-ilm dhati, by essence. This one is ilm fi'li. So this is after the action, Allah also knows. And this falls under the sami' al-basir. He sees all, He hears all. That can be heard or seen. Yeah.
I'm curious as to why Alim is more accepted as essence, action of essence, rather than Hakim, because Hakim seems to be more encompassing than knowledge.
No, but like what wisdom comes from knowledge, doesn't it?
It depends how you define wisdom.
Oh.
And there's a lot of definitions for wisdom.
I would think knowledge is within
Usually they see it the other way.
wisdom.
So you have, depending, the knowledge, if you say that, you see the way that it's usually, that
Because
the
someone could be
biggest
wise,
problem.
I mean, someone could be knowledgeable but
Yeah.
unjust.
Yes.
But someone who's a Hakim, he has knowledge,
Yeah.
and he'll have justice, and he'll have other attributes.
So you've already
He's more
put,
encompassing than just the ilm.
so you've already put wisdom a lot closer to the action. Just by the way you said it.
Okay.
And every attribute of action is derived from an attribute of essence. Where is it coming from? So Hakim becomes, in a way, it becomes the way it's usually defined is 2 or 3 or 4 other attributes put together. That he does not commit injustice, that if we
Right.
want to use it in negative. Okay?
But
Whereas
ilm is a part
ilm-
of that.
No, ilm is higher. And the issue that, it's an issue and that's the answer. The issue is ilm is self-evident. Hikmah is not.
Right, yeah.
So things that are self-evident are your core.
Okay.
And we're going to talk about that in a second, about al-alim. There are 2 notions that are self-evident and kind of impossible to define. And those are the notions of being and the notion of knowledge. And if you look at philosophy, or metaphysics in philosophy, it has 2 branches. Ontology, or the theory of being, and epistemology, or the theory of knowledge. Basically everything stems from those 2, being and knowledge. And they're impossible to define because they're self-evident to human beings. You can try to, you can write books to try to explain what they mean, but we don't know anything beyond them. The only thing we know is either knowledge or being. But anyways, so we'll stop here. Proving the attributes of essence. So what's the simplest proof? So this becomes your general principle. Okay? So for every attribute of essence, you can start with that, and that could be your only proof, and that's enough. Okay? The proof is, when we look at the world, we encounter them. So they must come from somewhere. Just like we said about the existence of things, we also say about the attributes of things. When we said we look at the world, we see that things are contingent. They're possible. They're conditional. They rely on something else. They're dependent. So where did they come from? What took them out of that state of limbo between non-existence and existence? That's for the being of the thing. Now you can say the same thing about its qualities. So every quality that you see, that you find in every entity, every attribute, you can ask the same question. Where did it come from? Well, at the end of the chain, you have to say it came from the necessary being. Otherwise, you're always going to be stuck in that same regressive, infinite loop. So whatever applied for the existence of everything also applies to the qualities of that existence. So when we look at the world, when you look at a creature, you can see, for instance, that it has beauty. So the beauty is a thing that is separate from that creature. So you can ask, where does that beauty come from? Or a perfection, in the words of philosophers. It has mercy, for instance. Okay, where does that mercy come from? It was placed there. It's not an intrinsic part of the thing. It could have not been there. That was a possibility. In that sense, it's contingent. So what made it there instead of not being there? That's the ultimate question.
So logically, there should be a source of everything in the world.
So source, so that's what we said. That's why I'm trying to link it. I know I'm repeating, but I need that point to be clear. So where we stopped last time is we said the existence of things requires a source. Now we want to add one more layer, and we say the qualities of everything also requires the same source. The same argument applies to the qualities of everything. So whatever you find must come from that necessary being. And that's why we said it's a creative cause, or it's a existential cause. It doesn't only cause the existence, it causes the qualities of that existence. So the first proof is we encounter them in the world, so we have to ask, where did they come from? So same logic, they come from the necessary being who is a creative cause. And this brings us back to the proof of the necessary being. Secondly, I'm not going to spend more time on this one. The little point at the end was the devotional character. So this was a point that was mentioned a few times. Can we come up with our own way to describe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or not? And so we talked a little bit about this during our recap session, and we said, generally speaking, there is no proof that can be really established, a valid proof that you cannot come up with your own attributes for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That said, a lot of our scholars in our Shia school, they say as a precaution, don't come up with your own. There should be something out there, because the issue, the danger is, who says that this is actually a perfection that you're attributing to God? So unless you are very confident that what you're using to describe God is actually a perfection, you may actually, expressing something blasphemous against God without realizing. So unless you're completely mastering all these theological notions and you really understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His attributes and His actions, you shouldn't be coming up with your own attributes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is what we refer to in Arabic, they call it tawqifiyat al-asma or tawqifiyat al-sifat. Tawqifiyya, basically the devotional nature. You don't come up with its own. It's fixed and it's prescribed by religion, and you just worship based on what you're told. That's tawqifi. So if we say Allah Rahim, I repeat Allah Rahim. Allah Rahman, Allah Rahman. I don't come up with new attributes from my own pocket, basically. And we said Al-Asha'ira are a lot more for the devotional, and they say all of them are devotional, all of them are tawqifiyya. Mu'tazila, the other school, the big school in Islamic theology, they say no, it's all rational. And as I said, there is no fixed opinion in the Shia school, although the majority says as a precaution, although there is no valid proof that it's forbidden, as a precaution you shouldn't do it unless you're 100% certain, and no one should have that kind of certainty. So now we go into the three attributes that we gave. So the first one is life. So he says if we look at things that are alive, what can we say about life? So first of all, in a lot of cases, the way life is understood is implying evolution, implying change, implying improvement, progress. So he says, of course, this one does not apply to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So right away, we have to eliminate that from the definition. So now, this is the exercise. This is an important exercise we're doing. It may seem very simple, but this is basically what's going to give us the key. This is how we apply the attributes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we look at the world, we see that something has a quality. For instance, life. Now we see that there's something in those things that are alive that has progress, evolution, change, transformation, but we know from the attributes of the necessary being that this cannot be the case, because we said He's absolutely simple. This would be an imperfection, a deficiency, a lack in a necessary being. So this cannot apply. Eliminate it. What's left? What's left is life is made up of two other things. Consciousness or awareness, that's one. And the second thing is, so that falls under knowledge. And the second one is will, intentionality, power. So life becomes a combination of two things. Something that has more life has more of these two. So if you have very little awareness, very little conscience, you have very little life. The more aware you are, the more life you have. The more will you have, the more life you have. Or to use the same attributes that we said until now, the more knowledge you have and the more power you have, the more life you have. So if we keep that in mind, then does that make life at the same level as knowledge and power? Or is life at a higher level, and out of life we can derive knowledge and power?
Seems like it's the latter. So one essentially knows.
So you reach one. So you're able to reach al-hayy, being the highest the most abstract of the attributes of essence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from which you can derive all the rest. This is where there's a disagreement between our scholars. So as I said, really the bottom line is, depending on how you define them, this is one way to define them. So I'm relying on the definition of the book, so I'm asking the question which he doesn't ask, because he says there are three. And he doesn't go into this notion that I'm explaining, which is you can derive attributes from other attributes. But really that's what it is. So in this book he doesn't cover that. But if you can derive some from others, and now he just defined life as basically, he doesn't use the words, but I'm adding them, as awareness and will, or really knowledge and power, then if knowledge and power are derived from life, then life is a higher order attribute. And from life, you can derive all the other attributes. And with those three, you can derive all the rest. Anyways, keep that in mind. Another point, I'm going to mention it very quickly. He says I'm not going to explain it, so I'm not going to explain it either. But this is basically for life specifically. How do we prove that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has life? So he said the first proof is we encounter it. Okay, that's going to apply to everything. All the attributes of Allah, especially attributes of essence, if you encounter them in the world, they must come from somewhere. They come from the necessary being, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's your first proof by default. Second proof is that life is immaterial. So life is not something material. It is an attribute of immaterial beings. That requires a sophisticated proof that he does not provide.
And it's completely opposite of what's accepted today.
Exactly.
100% opposite.
So he says life is the attribute of the non-material aspect of things that are alive. Not the material, not the physical. Okay, and that's why I'm not opening that door, because I don't know what's his proof. If he doesn't provide it, I can't say valid, not valid. He basically just gives you the philosophical principle in Islamic philosophy. This is a principle that life is the attribute of non-material beings. In other words, non-material beings, so it goes both ways. Non-material beings have life. That's one way to look at it. Therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has life. Or the other way, life is an attribute of non-material beings. So if you see life, you have to link it back to something non-material. So that can be, had he presented the proof for this, so he presents it as a claim in the book. So we're not going to go in deeper because there is no explanation provided for this one, but just to keep in mind, this is considered a philosophical principle in traditional Islamic philosophy. If you encounter life, it's the result of non-material being. And every non-material being has life. Therefore, they also have awareness and will and power. So keep that in mind as we move now to knowledge and power. Knowledge. First of all, to keep in mind, knowledge is considered the most self-evident notion in Islamic philosophy, along with being. So it's impossible to define it. When you say something is self-evident, good luck trying to define it. That's one.
And what do they say in the dictionary? Like, knowledge.
It's not going to be a philosophically valid definition. The thing is, when we encounter knowledge, as manifest as it is to us, or self-evident as it is, every manifestation, every example, every instance of knowledge that we encounter, just like we said about life, is going to be limited. It's going to be restricted. It's going to have deficiencies. So the exercise is to do the same thing we did. When I'm encountering life, I'm noticing that there are deficiencies that cannot be applied to a necessary being. For instance, transformation and improvement. You see that, like a human being, for instance, or the seed that goes from a less perfect to a more perfect state until it reaches its ultimate state. This cannot be applied to the necessary being. Doesn't change, fixed, stable, absolute, right? Same thing can be said about knowledge. So the moment you have any deficiency, any gap or imperfection in the notion, you get rid of it. And then he gives the proofs. First one. First proof, the same one as we said. So always keep it in mind. You encounter it in the world or not? Yes, we encounter knowledge in the world. So we know that knowledge must come from somewhere. So where does it come from? That's one. Two. This one, let's go back a few lessons. The teleological argument, the argument by design. When you look at the world, we said it proves not only the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the manner in which the world is created, but also a number of His attributes. Well, one of His attributes, I cannot prove the life of Allah, but I can prove His knowledge. If you look at a book, if I read a book, I can tell something about the knowledge of its author. If I read a poem, if I see a painting, it's a sign, it's an indication of the knowledge of the author of whatever I'm looking at. The world is the same thing. If I see the world, the more I understand how it's built, the more I understand that this required knowledge. And so you prove the existence of the, not only of God, but of one of His attributes, which is knowledge. So the teleological argument, that's why we said it proves a number of attributes. This is one of the attributes. There are others, and they'll come later. This is one of them. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala must have knowledge in order to create the world in the manner in which He created it. And if you understand that argument properly, the more you understand how much design there is, how complex the design is, the more you understand how much knowledge Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala must have. Three, He brings it back to the same argument that he just gave, which is, if every immaterial being has life, life is what? Awareness or knowledge and power. Therefore, Allah must have knowledge, because He's immaterial. And the other way around. So everything that is immaterial must have knowledge. That's the principle. Everything immaterial, non-material. Every entity that is non-material. Example, angels. Every entity that is non-material must have knowledge. And the other way around. Knowledge is an attribute of immaterial beings. For instance, your soul. Okay? Your soul, your spirit, not your body. Okay? That's if this principle is valid in Islamic philosophy. So it goes both ways. If you look at the entity, you say knowledge is only found in immaterial beings, and every immaterial being has knowledge. So you solve a lot of issues with that one if you can prove the validity of that principle. And then he adds a very quick point and a very important one, especially for the attribute of knowledge, for all of us, for practical purposes. Really understanding that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has knowledge can actually change the way we live. So he only gives this verse, which is very well known verse. It's basically you know that you're under Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's supervision, under His watch at all times. So this is perfect and very good for the sinning and non-sinning scenarios that we all fall into. There's another component, however, it's more your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That He knows, that He sees you, whatever state you're in. So in your hour of need, not only when you want to sin and you remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching. Okay, that is valid. But what about the rest? What about you can actually create a constant, continuous relationship with Allah, knowing that He knows, knowing that He sees, knowing that He hears. Your relationship becomes completely different, not only with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with the world. You are able to deal with difficulties in a completely different way. If you know, as Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam in Karbala, he says what? He says, what makes this bearable, all of these calamities bearable, is that they are happening under the watchful eye of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That changes completely your ability to deal with the difficulties of the world. That's it. I'm at peace if I know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is seeing all of this. So keep that in mind for more practical purposes.
It should be mixed. If I know that He's seeing and He's just too. Because if I know He's seeing,
of
but
course,
He's not just.
Yes, it's implied.
Yeah.
Power. So the main point to understand with power is to go back to something we said earlier. Power can be seen as once it has been applied, but its real definition is it's a potential. It's a will and an ability, and not necessarily executing or acting on that ability. If you have ability to run, it doesn't mean you're running. It just means you have ability to run. You can run if you put the will and the ability together, right? If you have the intention and you have the power to do so, that's power, both together. The will, the intention, and the ability, both together, give you power, which doesn't necessarily require you to apply that power to say you are powerful or you are able to, as with the example of running. So anyone can say you have the power to run even if you're not running right now.
But the same, with that explanation, the same could be said for being merciful or the creator.
100%.
Which could throw it into the attributes of essence if we define it that way.
100%.
Okay.
And those are the attributes. That's why we said we're going back to, depending on, is it before or after?
Okay, before, after.
If you say it's the power to, then it falls under power. And power is an attribute of essence.
Okay.
The power to see, the power to create, the power to hear, the power, they're all becoming attributes of essence.
Yeah.
But if you've created, if you've seen, if you've heard, then you've heard something, you've created something. So there's a relationship with something else on the other side.
So it's one block over.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So this is a question you had asked a few weeks ago. Okay, so here's an important point. Power concerns the possible by essence.
Okay.
So what does power apply to?
Things that can possibly happen.
Yes. So this is a big topic and it requires a little bit of this is a question that all the prophets and all the imams were asked again and again. Can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create another God like him? Can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make number 3 bigger than number 4? Or the question that was very famous, and I'll tell you 2 riwayat related to this one. I wasn't thinking of doing that, but let's finish with that. Someone came, let me start with Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. The same question was asked to Imam Sadiq and was asked to Imam Ali alayhi salam. Someone came to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam and told him, can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shrink the world to the size of an egg and everything else remains the same without making the egg bigger or the world smaller? So what did Imam Sadiq do? He told him, come walk with me, let's take a walk. Now Imam Sadiq alayhi salam walked with him to the top of a mountain. He told him, what do you see? Describe what you see. So I told him, I see the heavens, and I see the mountains, and I see the land, and I see the water. And the Imam told him, the one who was able to put everything you're seeing inside your eye, which is smaller than an egg, can put the world inside an egg. And he stopped there. Okay, keep that riwayah in mind. The same was asked of Imam Ali alayhi salam. I'm intentionally giving the Imam Sadiq example first. This is for us to learn how to read the riwayat of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salam. The same question was asked from Imam Ali alayhi salam. Can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put the world inside an egg without increasing the size of the egg or shrinking the size of the world? And the answer of Imam Ali alayhi salam in Arabic was, إِنَّ الَّذِي تَقُولُ لَا يَكُونُ. That which you say is basically nonsensical. It's a logical impossibility. The power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala applies to that which is possible. So the between brackets part that I'm saying is, sometimes the imams want to use a discursive tool. If you want to just argue with me, I'll beat you in your argument too. It doesn't necessarily, if you want a real answer, Imam Ali's answer is the philosophical answer. That's the real answer. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam is the discursive answer. If you just want to beat me with an argument, I'll beat you with your argument. And he beat him with the argument. He can't argue. The eye is smaller than the egg. And the whole world entered into the eye. Okay, so discursively he beat him. Philosophically he's working at another level. And that's why we have to learn how to analyze Riwayat Ahl al-Bayt properly when we see them. Which kind of answer is the Imam giving? Is he giving it because the person is a scholar and he's going to understand? Or is this a commoner who's probably not going to understand what Imam Ali alayhi salam answered when he said, إِنَّ الَّذِي تَقُولْ لَا يَكُونَ. That which you're describing can never be. Basically what you're asking is impossible. Not because Allah cannot do it, because it is impossible. It cannot receive that power from Allah. What you're describing doesn't make any sense. Basically, there's a logical impossibility with what you're asking. Anyways, so all he's saying here is that when the verse says إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٍ, it has to be a shay'. In some of our ruwayat, they say, what's a shay'? So it has to be logically valid for Allah's power to apply to it. Not logically based on our power and based on logic. It must be a valid logical relationship for Allah's power to apply to it. So that's one point. The second one, I think we explained it enough, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not necessarily need to put the power in action for us to say He has power. To say Allah has power to do something does not require Allah to do it. It's just maybe Allah is not willing to do it. There is no will at this time from Allah to do something. It doesn't mean He cannot do it. Okay, and this is important with the whole debates between Asha'ira and Mu'tazila and throwing all the prophets in hell or not. Our issue is not whether God has power. The issue is not with the power. They say Allah can. Of course Allah can. That's not our issue with you. Anyways, we'll talk more about that. Finally, absolute power entails absolute freedom. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may decide to do something or not something, but not because He's compelled from outside of Himself. So He has absolute freedom. There are no constraints to His power. And again, this is a little bit in reaction to maybe what some may say elsewhere.
So when we say God has will,
Yeah.
can we also say that He has like intent
Yes.
and a want? Could we say that word? That
Sure.
He wants?
Sure. Yes.
Okay.
وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا أَن يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ.
Okay. So intent, will, want, but
Yes.
will is more active.
Yeah, there is a whole debate about the difference between mashi'a and irada. Okay, but generally, yes, He has.
Because for us to want something, we first have to have an intention, right?
Yes, and ours is very limited. We're physical beings. We have all sorts of factors that influence us. A lot of it is external. It's not a raw will or a raw intent. Like you can psychoanalyze intent and say this is where it's coming from because of the way you were raised. Then today, 30 years later, this is your intent, right? You can always do that with a human. You can't do that with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you have to abstract it once again, and that's what we've been trying to do throughout. So can we apply or not what we see? Yes, but we have to learn how to abstract it so that we don't impose on Allah the same things the deficiencies that we find in the creatures, the attributes that are found in the creatures in a deficient manner. So, and this is maybe, these are my final remarks. They're not in the lesson. So the first one is, I think we have a lot of texts, and we talk a little bit about that, but just to make sure that we are all on the same page. If we read the Holy Quran or we read the Ad'iyah, we're going to see a lot of texts and a lot of instances where we have to be careful how to interpret them, so that our interpretation doesn't fall into the anthropomorphic way of understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if we keep all of this in mind. We have, for instance, we said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be in any space or in any time. Okay? So, you see, for instance, in Dua al-Hazin, Ya mawjudan unajika ya mawjudan fi kulli makan. I beseech you or invoke you or I call unto you, O you who are found everywhere. Does that mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is everywhere? And we're going to say this is an authentic hadith, let's say. This is a 100% authentic hadith, or I'm just using a dua now. We can do the same thing with the Holy Quran. A lot of examples. So the general principle, that's the key to me, the one that I want to make sure we all agree on, is we have things in our religion that are certain. If you reach a conclusion, a valid conclusion, you have certainty about a principle, then that becomes your main principle, and everything else has to be interpreted in light of that. Things are not equal anymore. If that becomes your principle, then everything else must be interpreted based on it. This is why the Holy Quran, for instance, says that there are in the Quran ambiguous verses and there are manifest or clear verses. And they are al-Kitab. They are the principles. If you really understand the verse that says لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, there is nothing like unto him, then you will not fall into the trap of Allah subhanahu. Yadullah fawqa aydihim is a hand of God, as though the physical hand of God is over their hands. Or Yawm al-Qiyamah waja'a rabbuka, and your Lord comes with the angels rank by rank. You won't fall into that trap because now you know laysa kamithlihi shay. Allah cannot come physically. Allah is not a body to move. So then what does it mean? So this becomes, in the easiest way to say it is you need a metaphorical interpretation to these. So when you say, for instance, in the dua, Ya mawjudan fi kulli makan, O you who are everywhere, it's not Allah who is there. Allah is not in a space. It's your actions, it's your signs, it's your knowledge, it's your power that is everywhere, that I see everywhere. Yeah.
Sayid, you mentioned that verse in the Quran where it talks about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the decisive verses and then metaphorical verses, and the continuation of that says, and the one who has like evil intent,
في قلوبهم مرض. Yes.
they use the metaphorical verses.
Yes.
And we always explain a lot of these verses metaphorically.
Yeah.
You know, Ahl al-Ta'wil, what else was referred to, right?
We say this is not ta'wil, but yes.
So when the Quran's talking about those people who use the metaphorical verses with evil intent, it's not all then that understand the verses metaphorically that have evil intention. But
No, there are some.
there are
some who will try to make the Quran say something by relying on verses that are open to interpretation. Instead of relying on the verses that are clear, that no one disputes, they rely on the verses that are open to interpretation to do something, whatever they feel like doing with it. They make the Quran say things it doesn't say.
So that verse is discussing people who relate metaphorical ideas on a decisive verse that doesn't require any metaphor.
Or a verse that is not decisive.
Or a verse, okay.
It doesn't matter. But they are doing it with
Bad intention.
yes. Yeah. And just as an example to keep in mind, because a lot of us, I think, we want to say, well, let's see what the Quran says. At the end of the battle of Siffin, when Imam Ali alayhi salam and Muawiyah, at the end of it, when they were about to win, but the group of Muawiyah, they finally raised the qara'in on top of their spears, and the trick worked, and the people with Imam Ali alayhi salam got duped, and they did not listen to the Imam who told them, attack and finish it, and they said, no, how do we attack people who are raising the Quran? Okay, they did not listen to the Imam, and the war stopped, and Muawiyah stayed in power, and all of that. Anyways, so what did they say? Al-Khawarij, that's when they started working from within the army of Imam Ali, and they said, let's do arbitration. Let's do an arbitration. Let's have an arbiter, a third party who will decide how do we solve all of this. It's not as though they were fighting in a one war for 18 months, and it was all done. Now let's decide how we're going to solve this. So what did Imam Ali alayhi salam do? What did he say? When it was decided and he said against it, he said this is not the way to solve this. At the end they said, his companions said, no, that's the only way. That's what we want. He said, if you have to do arbitration, then do not use the Quran. Which may seem surprising to a lot of us, especially those of us who say, we want to only use the Quran. Okay, well, you have Imam Ali alayhi salam here saying, don't use the Quran. Why? He says, إِنَّهُ حَمَّالْ ذُو أَوْجُهٍ. The Quran has many interpretations. So depending on the strength of whoever is going to be debating, they can make the Quran say whatever they want. Because the Imam is not allowed to go debate himself and to show them that their interpretation is wrong. So whoever is going to leave from the Imam's side is going to stand in opposition to someone else on the other side, and whoever is discursively stronger is going to win the debate. He said, do not use the Quran. The Quran is open to interpretation. And this is a link to this verse in Surah Al-Imran, that the Quran has these two types of verses. There are al-Kitab, the verses that are the decisive ones based on which you have to interpret the whole Quran. And then you have the other verses that are open to interpretation. They may have ambiguity. Anyways, so keeping that in mind, so if I see that there are verses that may not sit well with very valid principles, it's those verses that have to be reinterpreted. And the ta'wil, we have to be careful with the word ta'wil, because really any human being would do that for any text. If I read a piece of an essay or an article and I read something, I don't need the author to tell me, and by the way, I'm going to use a metaphor here. Just from the way I read it, I know, okay, this is obviously a metaphorical use of this expression or this word or this proverb, right? So this is a normal way of understanding. It's a logical way people talk. So of course the Quran used all of these as part of its rhetoric. So we cannot, I refuse to be called Ahl al-Ta'wil just because I'm using common sense in interpreting the Quran. I'm still at the first level. I accept Ta'wil, but not here. This is not even Ta'wil yet. Don't tell me that, so basically every time every human being is reading an article with a hint of a metaphorical use is Ahl al-Ta'wil. No. So to me, Ta'wil is a lot deeper. It's the meaning that can only be known by al-Rasikhuna fil ilm. Okay, this is meaning that I cannot reach with my mind. I need an external power who knows the codes, who knows the secrets of the Quran to tell me what that is. This is where I accept to be Ahl al-Ta'wil. The Ta'wil doesn't come from my pocket. The Ta'wil comes from the infallible who tells me, and this verse can also mean. I'm going to use a bad example, but let's say the verse وَالتِّينِ وَالزَّيْتُونِ, when the Imam says it could be al-Hassan wal-Hussein. Okay, I can never, assuming that this is a valid narration, I could never reach that with my mind. I can sit there and think and read and write and study. This is Ta'wil. This is a part that I can never reach. And now I understand, okay, why it's only al-Rasikhuna fil ilm. I can never know what the beginning of Surah Maryam, Kaf, Ha, Ya, Ain, Sad means. I can come up with 17 different interpretations. Maybe they're valid, maybe none of them are valid. I need ta'wil.
And they always use ta'wil.
Who's they?
Like, for example, on the opposite side, when they accuse us of it, like, I was talking to a friend of mine, he's a Salafi guy, and he says, God has hands in a way that befits him. I'm like, this is not ta'wil?
So that is, see, the way that, in a manner that befits him.
In a manner that befits him.
So they are doing the same thing.
They're doing the same thing.
Yeah.
And then
So
they
we could do
accuse
this.
the
Yeah,
other side of
exactly.
that.
Yes.
It's a funny thing.
Okay. The second thing, and I think we talked a little bit about that, so I won't spend too much time on it. This is something that as I said last week, Ahl al-Bayt alayhim as-salam, they taught us, they gave us a key, a rule. If we understand it, we avoid falling into the two big traps in theology. And these are التشبيه والتعطيل. So the thingness, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, can He be said to be a thing? Is Allah a thing? When the Imams are asked, can we say about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He is a shay', a thing? They don't know. It's a very, very philosophical question. And the answer of the Imam is yes, say He is a thing. So long as you do not put Him under the constraints of ta'til and tashbih. Okay, so what is ta'til and what is tashbih? What are these two problems? Tashbih basically means you're making Allah similar to other things. So you can say He's a thing, He's a shay'. Shay' la kal ashya. He is a thing not like any other thing. Okay, so that's the extent to which you can say He's a thing. Only. He's a thing, but He's not a thing like any other thing. That's one. And that's what the Quran says. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. That's one. What's ta'til? Ta'til is don't fall into the trap of paralyzing your mind. So when you're told, what does it mean to say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Qadir, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has power, you say, I don't know what it means. I just repeat the word, but I don't know what it means. The Imam says, no, you can say that He has power. The same power that you see in the world, Allah has that. But He has the sublime example of that power. He has the example that does not have the deficiency, the imperfection of the power that you see in the world. So this becomes our key. Because people have fallen into two problems when they came to theology. In other religions and in our religion. Either they do tashbih, so to understand an attribute, they make it like the one that is found in other creatures. You can't do that. The moment you do that, you don't understand God. So you fall into either kufr or shirk. Very simple. Or you say, I don't know what it means. I'm agnostic in that sense. I don't know what it means. I just say the word as it is. Qadir, Qadir. Alim, Alim. What does Alim mean? What does it mean when we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has knowledge? I don't know. We don't understand Allah's knowledge and you stop there. Okay, but it means you don't understand knowledge. You're just basically repeating the word and you're doing ta'til. So the Imams refuse ta'til. They say no. Understand, there is a positive aspect to what you understand in the attributes of God. You do understand something, but learn to do it in a way that doesn't make you fall into tashbih. That's the key. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a thing. Yes, Allah is a thing, but don't fall into tashbih. And this makes you avoid ta'til as well. I think we covered the last point. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل